There is a time in our past known only as shadow, a stretch of centuries, dim, silent, and strange. They call it the Dark Ages, a name whispered through generations as if something was lost, or perhaps hidden. But what if this era was never as dark as we were led to believe? What if the Dark Ages were not a time of ignorance, but the cover story for one of history's greatest secrets? Get comfortable, settle in, because what you're about to hear may forever change how you view the past. When we hear the phrase Dark Ages, a specific image forms. Europe lost in fog, ruled by superstition, disease, and endless wars. 1,000 years of silence, of decay, of ignorance. But what if that's not the truth? What if the narrative we were taught was carefully constructed? A lens shaped by those who stood to benefit from darkness? The term Dark Ages wasn't used by those who lived through them. It came much later, in the 14th century, from a poet named Francesco Petrarch. To him, the world had fallen from the grace of Greece and Rome. He mourned a golden age, not because he knew the past, but because he idealized it. Petrarch saw a fading of light, not destruction, but a decline. He never meant to erase a millennium. And yet, that's what happened. Centuries later, during the Enlightenment, new thinkers needed contrast. They claimed their age was light, reason, science, civilization. To make that light brighter, they deepened the shadow behind them. They labeled the medieval world as backwards, foolish, stagnant. And so, the myth was born. 1,000 years were cast in darkness, not by truth, but by comparison. To this day, we carry that distortion. In schools, in books, in documentaries, the Middle Ages are often reduced to plague, fire, and ignorance. But history says otherwise. In reality, this so-called dark period was filled with light, just hidden in places we weren't told to look. Across Europe, monasteries preserved ancient texts. Farmers invented tools still in use today. Cities traded with distant lands. And scholars, in candlelit silence, copied the wisdom of the ancients. The church, often painted as suppressive, also protected knowledge. Medieval monks translated and safeguarded works by Plato, Aristotle, and Galen. Without them, the Renaissance may never have happened. So why was this age dismissed? Because glorifying the Renaissance meant diminishing what came before. To celebrate progress, they needed a fall. To crown the Enlightenment, they had to bury the Middle Ages. But as the buried truth rises, a question emerges. Was this a misunderstanding of history, or something more deliberate? To find the answer, we must look at the moment this narrative began, the fall of the Roman Empire. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire fell, or so the story goes. Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor, was deposed. A Germanic general, Odoacer, took power. Historians have long called this the end of civilization. But was it? The empire had been unraveling for centuries. Corruption, civil wars, invasions, economic collapse. Rome's decline wasn't a sudden fall, it was a slow erosion. And when the Western Empire fell, chaos did not consume all. Instead, something new began. The so-called barbarians, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Franks, built kingdoms atop Roman ruins. They adopted Roman law, preserved its architecture, continued its traditions. In Italy, King Theodoric of the Ostrogoths ruled with Roman grace. He respected Roman culture, protected Roman buildings, maintained Roman customs. His rule was one of order, not ruin. Meanwhile, in the East, the Byzantine Empire thrived. Its capital, Constantinople, became a jewel of art, science, and trade. It preserved ancient knowledge while Europe transformed. So why do we still call this a collapse? Because later scholars, Renaissance minds, Enlightenment philosophers chose that framing. To elevate their era, they buried the one before. But archaeology paints a different picture. We've uncovered tools, texts, manuscripts, and trade routes from this era, all showing complexity, not decay. Monasteries were not just religious centers. They were libraries, laboratories, places where knowledge was guarded against time. So we ask again, why has this truth remained hidden? Who benefits from casting 1,000 years in shadow? Because when we stop to look, truly look, the Dark Ages weren't dark at all. They were the ember, not the ashes, and perhaps that ember was hidden for a reason. Across medieval Europe, behind stone monastery walls, a quiet revolution unfolded. In places like Monte Cassino, St. Gallen, and deep within the Vatican itself, monks devoted their lives to one sacred task: preserving knowledge from the ancient world. By candlelight, they copied the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Euclid, word for word, line by line, ensuring that the flame of wisdom never fully died. But this preservation was not without purpose or control, because the Church, while guarding the past, also became its gatekeeper. Not every scroll was shared. Not every text was allowed to see the light of day. What could be read and what must remain hidden was tightly regulated. Access was limited. Monastic libraries were sealed to outsiders. And behind those locked doors, the Church held power. Centuries later, some of these long-hidden texts surfaced, and with them, a revelation. Ideas we thought were born in the Renaissance, in astronomy, medicine, and mathematics had already existed, silently kept within monastery walls. Some theories once branded as heresy had been studied, even mastered, by medieval monks, long before the world was ready to hear them. Why did the Church withhold them? The answer is power. Knowledge, in its purest form, is control. By deciding what humanity could know and when, the Church shaped history itself. It wasn't only fear of heresy, it was fear of collapse. Too much truth too soon could shatter the foundations of society. So truth was rationed, censored, hidden. Ironically, the same secrecy that preserved knowledge for generations also earned the Church its reputation for oppression. But reality is never simple. The truth lies between extremes. The Church was both guardian and jailer, preserver and censor. And this pattern isn't unique. The greatest example of lost knowledge doesn't lie in Europe, but in Alexandria. There, on the Egyptian coast, rose the most legendary library in human history, a beacon of wisdom, a sanctuary for every field of thought. Built around 285 BCE, the Library of Alexandria housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls, from philosophy to astronomy, medicine to metaphysics. It attracted the world's brightest minds, a global center of discovery, centuries ahead of its time. And then, it vanished. The official story tells of a fire in 48 BCE during Julius Caesar's siege, a catastrophe that erased history in a single blaze. But many scholars now believe that version is too simple. The library may have declined slowly, piece by piece, as political powers rose and fell. Some point to the 4th century, when Christian emperors targeted so-called pagan centers of knowledge. Others blame the Muslim conquest in the 7th century. But deeper questions remain. Was it truly destroyed? Or was it hidden? Could some of its most valuable scrolls have been relocated, smuggled to secret libraries across the Mediterranean? Recent discoveries suggest it's possible. Ancient texts uncovered in European monasteries contain advanced knowledge we once believed was lost in Alexandria. Coincidence? Or connection? Some researchers suggest that fragments of the Alexandrian archive were absorbed into the church's guarded collections, preserved under layers of secrecy. Others go further. They believe secret societies, like the Hermetic Order, the Knights Templar, or even the Illuminati, protected this knowledge from censorship and used it to shape history. Among these preserved texts were precise star charts, complex equations, and strange maps showing continents as they should not have been known. Whispers of ancient technology, hints at cosmic truths, knowledge meant only for the initiated. If these theories hold even a grain of truth, then the burning of the Library of Alexandria wasn't just a tragedy. It was a cover-up, a reshuffling of history, a delay in progress, a theft from all humanity. The boldest researchers argue it never truly disappeared. They believe it still exists, not in one place, but scattered, hidden in vaults, beneath temples, locked in archives across the world. A puzzle waiting to be solved. And while these theories remain controversial, one thing is certain. The loss of Alexandria set humanity back by centuries. We were forced to rediscover what we once already knew, and perhaps not everything has been rediscovered yet. If Alexandria was lost in fire and secrecy, Byzantium was quietly erased by omission. The Eastern Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, was born in 330 AD, when Constantine moved Rome's capital to Constantinople. And while Western Europe sank into darkness, Byzantium thrived. It lasted for more than 1,000 years, an empire of trade, science, culture, and unmatched resilience. And yet, in the history books of the West, it's barely a footnote. Why? Because Byzantium was not Europe. It was not the West. It was something different. And to Renaissance thinkers, that made it inconvenient. But Byzantium was a beacon. Its capital, Constantinople, was a crossroads of civilization, a place where East met West, where knowledge was preserved, studied, and passed on. Byzantine scholars didn't just copy ancient texts, they annotated, expanded, and translated them. Their libraries became treasure vaults of science and philosophy. And when these texts returned to Europe centuries later, they sparked the Renaissance itself. One building says it all: the Hagia Sophia. A structure so advanced, its dome defied the understanding of its time. It remains a symbol, not just of faith, but of forgotten brilliance. So why has Byzantium been ignored? Because the story of history is often told by those who wish to simplify it, to divide it into light and dark, good and bad, progress and decay. And Byzantium doesn't fit that story. But it existed, it thrived, and it left behind a legacy the world still doesn't fully understand. The shadow over Byzantium wasn't cast by time, it was cast by choice. Western historians, shaped by ideology and pride, chose to forget, to erase the brilliance of a civilization that once preserved the light. This historical amnesia wasn't accidental. It was reinforced by a deeper divide, one that split the soul of Christendom itself. In 1054, the Great Schism shattered the Christian world in two: Rome and Constantinople, Catholicism and Orthodoxy. From that moment, Byzantium was no longer a cultural sibling. It was a rival, and rivals are rarely remembered with kindness. The wound deepened in 1204 when the Fourth Crusade, meant to reclaim Jerusalem, turned inward. Instead of marching east, it veered off course and sacked Constantinople. The holiest city in Eastern Christendom was looted and desecrated by fellow Christians. The betrayal was so profound, so shameful, that Western historians quietly turned away. And with that silence, Byzantium faded from textbooks, from memory, from the Western story of progress. But history doesn't disappear. It waits. And when Constantinople fell in 1453, it didn't just mark the end of an empire. It ignited a new beginning. Byzantine scholars, fleeing Ottoman conquest, carried ancient knowledge with them. Texts, ideas, and insights preserved for centuries in Eastern libraries suddenly flowed westward. These refugees seeded the Renaissance. They didn't merely spark it, they built its foundation. And so, a forgotten empire became the hidden architect of the West's rebirth. But the paradox remains: the civilization that preserved Western knowledge was erased by Western history. And Byzantium wasn't the only victim of narrative. There were others, peoples who bore the weight of a single word: barbarians. We know the image well: savage warriors, Viking raiders, Germanic tribes smashing the gates of Rome. But where did that image come from? The term barbarian began as something simple, a Greek word for those who spoke a foreign tongue. It imitated the sound, barbar, unintelligible speech. It didn't mean uncivilized, it just meant different. But as Rome grew, the meaning darkened. Anyone outside the empire became a threat, an outsider, an enemy. The label became a weapon, and for centuries, it stuck. But peel back the propaganda, and the truth begins to shift. The Germanic tribes, long seen as Rome's destroyers, were also Rome's inheritors. They adopted its legal systems, built upon its roads, preserved its traditions. Archaeological finds show detailed craftsmanship in metalwork, tools, jewelry. They weren't mindless warriors. They were engineers, farmers, artisans. The Goths tell the same story. King Theodoric, ruling Italy in the 6th century, upheld Roman law. He restored cities, respected learning, and under his reign, a fragile peace took root. Not destruction, preservation. And then there were the Vikings. Long vilified as ruthless pirates, they were far more than raiders. They were explorers, traders, navigators of impossible seas. From Scandinavia to North Africa, even to North America, they left signs of contact and commerce. Their ships were unmatched. Their writing system, runes, captured myth and lore. And their legacy? It shaped nations. In many ways, Viking raids spurred the creation of Europe's first strong, centralized kingdoms. So why the distortion? Because history was written by Rome, by the Church, by those who needed to define us and them. Civilized versus savage, light versus dark. It was a story dash, not always a truth. Now, through modern archaeology, that story is being rewritten, and the so-called barbarians are beginning to speak. What we find are not villains, but builders, thinkers, cultures rich with complexity and resilience. And perhaps the true barbarism was not theirs, but ours in refusing to see them clearly. So, if entire civilizations could be misrepresented for centuries, what else has been hidden? To find the answer, we must return once more to the source of silence, the monasteries. We imagine them as places of peace, of quiet, of prayer, but beneath stone walls and candlelight, another mission was underway. When Rome fell, cities burned, libraries vanished, illiteracy spread. Yet, in the most remote corners of Europe, monks became guardians. They copied texts line by line, not just religious works, but science, medicine, and philosophy. But their task wasn't merely preservation, it was protection. They chose which books could be shared, and which must remain hidden. Behind locked doors, in chambers unseen, lay scrolls too dangerous for the world above. Some challenged the Church's teachings, others revealed knowledge far ahead of its time, and so they were sealed away. Modern discoveries are beginning to pull back that curtain. At Monte Cassino, at St. Gallen, and deep within Vatican vaults, we've found traces of forgotten genius. Manuscripts describing planetary movement, centuries before Copernicus, surgical methods and medical treatments once thought impossible for the Middle Ages. Ideas from Greece, Egypt, Persia, and the Islamic Golden Age, all quietly preserved. But why were they hidden? Because knowledge can be dangerous. To the Church, radical ideas could shatter faith, undermine authority, and spark rebellion. So, truth was preserved, but not revealed. Monks understood the value of what they held, but their duty was not to spread it, it was to wait. And thanks to their silent protection, these texts survived across centuries of censorship, war, and decay. But there was a cost, because that silence also created a gap, a void in our understanding. And so, history misjudged the Middle Ages as empty, as ignorant, when in truth, they were alive with quiet brilliance. We were told the monasteries were silent, peaceful places of prayer, retreats from the world. But slowly, that veil is lifting, and behind it, we see something different. Not simply places of worship, but strongholds of hidden power, fortresses of forgotten wisdom. These were the guardians of the knowledge we were never meant to know. And if the secrets preserved within monastery walls make us question what else has been erased, then the story of Charlemagne and the Renaissance he sparked demands a second look. Charlemagne, Charles the Great, he is remembered as a warrior, a unifier, the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But his greatest conquest was not land. It was the revival of lost culture. Under Charlemagne's reign, in the late 8th century, a spark of light returned to Europe. A spark history would later try to dim. This was the Carolingian Renaissance, a quiet intellectual rebirth centuries before the famous Italian one. While Europe was still reeling from Rome's collapse, Charlemagne did something few rulers dared. He chose knowledge over conquest. He built schools, he founded libraries, he resurrected the wisdom of Greece and Rome, not to glorify the past, but to rebuild the future. His court in Aachen became a sanctuary of intellect, and at its center was Alcuin of York, a scholar whose influence still echoes today. Under Alcuin's guidance, ancient texts were recovered and copied. Philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, all studied in silence beneath vaulted stone. From this came a script, Carolingian minuscule, elegant, clear, uniform. It would later become the foundation for modern Western writing. But the Carolingian revival was not only artistic, it was scientific. Recently discovered manuscripts show that Charlemagne's scholars studied planetary movement, celestial calculations, ideas that would not be widely accepted until centuries later by Copernicus and Galileo. So, why was this period forgotten? Because those who came after, the scholars of the Renaissance, needed darkness behind their light. To glorify their age, they buried the one before. They erased Charlemagne's revival to make their revolution look brighter, and yet traces remain. Lost manuscripts found in monastery archives speak of advanced studies once condemned as heretical. Fearing church censorship, monks hid these works. Some were lost forever, others were burned, and a few survived. And now, piece by piece, we begin to see. Charlemagne was not just a king, he was an architect of rebirth, a hidden founder of the very Renaissance that claimed to eclipse him. But if Charlemagne's intellectual legacy was quietly erased, so too were the inventions of his age. We've long been told that the Middle Ages were stagnant, backward, empty of innovation. But this too was a myth. Recent findings tell another story, one of brilliance hidden beneath stone and ash. Take the mechanical clock. Officially, it appeared in the 13th century, but excavations in European monasteries have unearthed mechanisms far older, from the 10th, even the 9th century. These ancient devices, with their interlocking gears and precision movements, challenge our understanding of medieval science. Who built them? And why were they forgotten? Look also to the Gothic cathedrals, masterpieces of engineering. Notre Dame, Chartres, they rise like stone prayers. But these weren't just acts of faith, they were feats of physics, vaulted ceilings, flying buttresses, perfect symmetry. They hid. They let history forget. Later, Enlightenment thinkers, eager to promote their own genius, dismissed these achievements. By painting the Middle Ages as dark and ignorant, they made themselves look like saviors. But new evidence is rewriting that story. In cities like Aachen, Prague, Venice, and deep beneath old cathedrals, discoveries are surfacing: steam-powered designs, drawings of engines, concepts that predate the Industrial Revolution by centuries. Some of these secrets were found in Vatican vaults, scrolls that spoke of power and pressure, of pistons and heat. One document from the 12th century Spain describes a primitive steam engine, 500 years before James Watt. What if this knowledge hadn't been buried? What if the Middle Ages weren't stalled, but stifled? How far ahead could humanity have gone? What inventions never saw daylight? What ideas were sacrificed to preserve power? And then there's the Black Death, a name etched into the bones of Europe. Between 1347 and 1351, nearly a third of the continent died. It was said to come from the east, from rats aboard trading ships, a natural disaster, a plague with no face. But as we've seen, history hides things well. Was the Black Death only a disease, or was it something more? A disaster of opportunity, a tool in the hands of power? The Black Death, a name carved into the bones of Europe, a plague that swept across the continent from 1347 to 1351 and left nearly 1/3 of the population dead. We've been told it was nature's wrath, a cruel accident, a random plague carried by rats from distant lands. But now, new evidence casts a longer, darker shadow. Was it truly random? Or was it used? Newly uncovered records suggest the medieval elite, nobles, clergy, and monarchs may have seen the plague as something more than a tragedy. They saw it as an opportunity. In the panic and devastation, power was up for grabs. Documents found deep within monastery archives describe how the church used the plague to tighten its grip. It was declared a divine punishment, a sign that only obedience could bring salvation. Fear became faith, and fear was weaponized. People submitted. To survive, they obeyed, blindly, desperately. Entire societies fell under tighter control than ever before. And while some regions quickly established quarantines, others were abandoned. Why? Scholars now question whether certain areas were deliberately left vulnerable, neglected to eliminate political threats or rebellious populations. One theory, once dismissed as superstition, has resurfaced: the poisoning of wells. Now supported by archaeological finds and forensic analysis, some believe this tactic was real, used to either spread or blame the plague for political gain. But the devastation wasn't just biological, it reshaped power. The labor force collapsed, giving the elite a chance to rebuild the social order in their image. New laws were passed: harsh taxes, restricted movement, increased religious regulation. Society was reforged under stricter control. And yet, it didn't have to be. Vatican records and secret monastery scrolls reveal something shocking. They may have known how to limit the spread. Basic knowledge of sanitation, quarantine, and disease management already existed, but it was kept quiet. Why? Because panic made the population easier to control. The plague wasn't just a disaster, it became a tool, a storm turned into strategy. So we must ask, was the Black Death only nature's fury, or was it a calculated moment of human manipulation? And if that's true, how many other tragedies have been twisted into opportunity? If the Black Death showed us that history can be manipulated, then it's time to shift our gaze far from the ruined villages of medieval Europe to a place of golden brilliance, the Islamic world. Because while Europe struggled in fear and silence, the Islamic Golden Age lit up the world with knowledge. From the 8th to the 13th century, cities like Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and Damascus became the intellectual capitals of the world. Here, scholars didn't just preserve Greek and Roman wisdom, they expanded it. They translated Aristotle, they corrected Ptolemy, they advanced medicine, chemistry, astronomy, mathematics. They built observatories, hospitals, libraries. They mapped the stars. They calculated planetary orbits with precision the West wouldn't see for centuries. In mathematics, they gave us algebra, a term from Al-Khwarizmi's groundbreaking text. In medicine, Avicenna's Canon of Medicine became the most studied medical book in Europe for over 500 years. In astronomy, they designed tools like astrolabes and early telescopic lenses. They mapped the cosmos, and in doing so, shaped future European discoveries. But here's the truth no one wanted to tell. This knowledge flowed directly into Europe, through Spain and Sicily, regions under Islamic influence for centuries. In Cordoba and Toledo, libraries full of Arabic texts became the bridge. European scholars came, copied, and carried this wisdom home. Without this bridge, there would be no Renaissance. So why was this legacy forgotten? Because history is political. And after the Crusades, when Christian and Islamic worlds clashed, the idea that Europe's rebirth came from its rival was unacceptable. And so the story changed. The West claimed its rebirth came from within, that it had reawakened all on its own, Arabic names were erased. Translations were passed off as original. Entire civilizations vanished from the record. But scrolls don't lie. Recent archaeological discoveries from libraries in Spain, Sicily, and even old monasteries prove otherwise. Texts in Latin bear unmistakable signs of Arabic origin. Diagrams, annotations, the fingerprints of a forgotten empire. The Renaissance was built, in part, on foundations laid in Baghdad, and only now are we beginning to admit it. And if that truth has shaken you, if it forces us to rethink where progress truly came from, then prepare for something even more disturbing. What if time itself is not what we think? In 1991, German historian Heribert Illig proposed a theory so bold it stunned scholars across the world. He called it the phantom time hypothesis. His claim? That nearly 300 years of history, from 614 to 911 AD, never happened. According to Illig, we are not living in the 21st century, but somewhere closer to the 18th. It began with a pattern. Illig noticed a strange stillness in the record. Few buildings, few documents, no clear signs of technological or societal evolution. For nearly 300 years, Europe appeared frozen. Then he looked at Charlemagne, the emperor we revere as a historical giant. Illig found the records lacking, inconsistent, sparse. Was Charlemagne real? Or was he a fabricated figure invented to fill a historical gap? But the most compelling clue came from the calendar. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII corrected the Julian calendar by removing 10 days. But based on the known drift in the Julian system, the calendar should have been off by 13 days, not 10. A 3-day discrepancy. Illig saw this as proof. 3 missing days, 3 missing centuries, a phantom time. Mainstream historians quickly rejected his hypothesis. They cited Chinese and Islamic records. They pointed to carbon dating. But the silence remains. Why does this period feel so empty? Why do the gaps persist? Perhaps it was not a mistake. Perhaps it was inserted. A manipulated stretch of time designed to reshape the present. To place certain rulers in power. To align millennia for symbolic control. If history can be rewritten, if civilizations can be erased, if pandemics can be twisted into opportunity, then time itself may not be beyond manipulation. The phantom time hypothesis shook the foundations of history. It questioned not just what we know, but when we know it. And yet, its critics remain vocal. Mainstream historians argue that global civilizations outside Europe, like the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and especially Tang Dynasty China, show no phantom gap. Their timelines are continuous, their records intact, their artifacts real. From imperial edicts to astronomical observations, these cultures documented history without pause. In short, if nearly 300 years had been fabricated, the rest of the world didn't seem to notice. Then there's the science. Radiocarbon dating of Carolingian-era sites, structures, tools, burial grounds, consistently aligns with the traditional European timeline. No missing centuries, no temporal void. That's why most historians dismiss Illig's theory as fiction, a puzzle with too many pieces that simply don't fit. And yet, the questions persist, because even with strong evidence, anomalies remain. Gaps in the archaeological record, sparse documentation of major rulers, ambiguities that stubbornly resist resolution. Some now argue that phantom time, if it existed, may have been localized, not a global deception, but a European one, perhaps orchestrated by powerful institutions, the Church, the Holy Roman Empire, to reshape timelines for political, spiritual, or symbolic gain. In this version, time was manipulated not across continents, but within kingdoms, not by science, but by power. But maybe the hypothesis was never about dates at all. Maybe its real message is this: history can be altered, not always by lies, but by omission, by silence, by those who control the story. And that idea lingers, because once you suspect history can be rewritten, you begin to question what else has been forgotten. And that brings us to the Celts and their elusive guardians of wisdom, the Druids. They were called barbarians, pagans, savages, but were they? Or were they victims of a narrative designed to erase them? At their peak, the Celts ruled lands stretching from Ireland and Scotland to France, Germany, and Eastern Europe. They built vibrant societies, sophisticated, spiritual, and rich in tradition. And yet, they are remembered mainly for one thing: sacrifice. The stories come from their conquerors, especially Julius Caesar, who painted them as wild, dangerous, and uncivilized. But Rome needed them to look that way, because Rome needed an excuse. Recent archaeology tells a different tale. At sites like Hallstatt, Laten, and across Britain and Ireland, we've uncovered advanced craftsmanship, exquisite metalwork, and sophisticated social systems. Weapons, jewelry, tools, all beautifully designed, all unmistakably Celtic. They even developed their own writing system, Ogham, carved into standing stones. These weren't random markings. They encoded calendars, astronomy, philosophy. This was not a primitive people. And at the center of it all were the Druids. To Rome, they were sorcerers, but in truth, they were scholars, judges, doctors, scientists. They studied the stars, healed the sick, interpreted nature. Some evidence even suggests they used structures like Stonehenge to track celestial alignments, long before such knowledge was common elsewhere. So why were they erased? Because their knowledge was oral, passed from mind to mind, not paper to parchment. When the Romans invaded, they destroyed the centers of Druidic learning. They silenced the teachers, and the teachings died with them. The Celts valued freedom, revered nature. They had systems of social equality that threatened imperial power. So they were labeled barbarians and forgotten. But now, as ruins are excavated and stones are read once more, the truth is resurfacing. The Celts were never primitive, they were silenced. And their silence was strategic, because to erase a people, you must erase their wisdom. And to preserve power, you must bury what threatens it. This is the pattern, again and again. And it brings us to another myth, another supposed truth, the myth of medieval ignorance. We were taught that the Middle Ages were steeped in illiteracy, that superstition reigned, that no one thought, no one read, no one questioned. But once again, that story doesn't hold. By the 11th and 12th centuries, cities like Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and Cambridge had become centers of learning. Universities were formed, not just for theology, but for law, medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Libraries housed hundreds of manuscripts. Students debated philosophy. Professors taught geometry and logic, the very seeds of modern science. Even beyond academia, education flourished. In cities like Venice, Florence, and London, merchants and artisans knew how to read and write. Letters, contracts, records, proof of a literate, thinking society. And these skills weren't reserved for nobles or priests. They were used by the working class, the ones history often forgets. So why did the Renaissance portray the Middle Ages as a thousand-year void? Because contrast is powerful. By casting themselves as saviors, Renaissance scholars elevated their era. They painted the past in darkness to make their light seem brighter. But the truth is more subtle. The Middle Ages were not the death of reason. They were the bridge. A bridge between ancient wisdom and the modern world. A period of slow, steady progress. Forgotten because it was quiet. The scholars of medieval Europe didn't just copy the past, they protected it. They preserved Greek, Roman, and Arabic knowledge. They refined it. They passed it forward. Without them, the Renaissance may never have come. So no, the Middle Ages were not an age of ignorance. They were an age of guarded light, a light the world is only now learning to see again. Without the quiet diligence of medieval scholars, the Renaissance might have never arrived. They preserved ancient wisdom, expanded it, passed it on, and yet for centuries we were taught that the Middle Ages were barren, intellectually void. Today, we know better. Discoveries in Vatican archives, university vaults, and monastery libraries across Europe have revealed something undeniable. Medieval education wasn't poor. It was rich, layered, surprisingly advanced. It gave birth to the systems we still use today. And as we reassess this forgotten era, we begin to realize the ignorance wasn't in the Middle Ages. It was in how they were remembered. But if the distortion of education was deliberate, what else might have been intentionally hidden? That question leads us into darker territory, because history isn't only about what's recorded. Sometimes it's about what's destroyed. During the so-called Dark Ages, knowledge became a weapon, and whoever controlled it controlled the world. Religious and political authorities understood this. They allowed only what aligned with their doctrines to survive. Everything else? Erased. Philosophers like Epicurus and Democritus, scientists like Aristarchus and Hipparchus, their works were banned, buried, or burned. Why? Because their ideas, freedom of thought, atomic theory, heliocentrism, threatened the Church's authority over the heavens and the soul. So they disappeared. One of the most revealing rediscoveries came from a remote German monastery in the 15th century. It was a single manuscript, Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, a Roman poem describing atoms, physics, and a godless universe. It had been missing for over 1,000 years. Its return stunned scholars and confirmed that many texts had never been lost by accident. Another case. In Constantinople, ancient mathematical writings by Archimedes were found, overwritten with Christian prayers. It took X-ray technology to peel back the layers and expose what had been hidden beneath. His calculations were centuries ahead of their time, but for generations, they were literally buried under doctrine. Why this destruction? Because ideas spark questions, and questions challenge power. Those in control knew that true knowledge could inspire revolutions, so they suppressed it. They delayed progress by centuries. The Renaissance didn't invent modern thought. It unearthed what had long been forbidden. And now, as these texts emerge from monasteries and Vatican vaults, we're seeing how much humanity once knew and how much it was forced to forget. But the deception went further. The concept of a dark age itself was never global. It was uniquely European. Because while Europe stumbled, Asia thrived. In China, the Tang and Song dynasties ushered in a golden age of innovation. Between the 7th and 13th centuries, China developed gunpowder, the compass, paper-making, movable type printing centuries before Gutenberg. The West rarely mentions this. China also pioneered a structured civil service. Its imperial examination system ensured that governance was rooted in merit, not bloodline. It created a class of educated bureaucrats unmatched in the world. At the same time, poetry, art, and literature reached staggering heights. Figures like Li Bai and Du Fu left legacies still celebrated today. But in the West, silence. And it wasn't just China. India, during the Gupta and Chola periods, made groundbreaking discoveries. They developed the concept of zero, the very foundation of modern math. Thinkers like Aryabhata and Brahmagupta calculated planetary orbits, explored gravity, and wrote works that rival anything in Europe centuries earlier. Yet, Western history told another story. It claimed Asia was backward, primitive, in need of saving. This lie fueled centuries of colonialism and conquest. And to justify it, history was rewritten. But now, ancient manuscripts are re-emerging. Independent researchers have translated texts hidden for centuries. And the truth is clear. The Dark Ages were not universal. They were not shared by the world. While Europe struggled, Asia advanced, and that truth can no longer be denied. Because history is not owned by the West. Progress was never theirs alone. The more we uncover, the more we understand that civilization is a shared legacy. And that truth, once buried, always finds its way back to the light. But within Europe itself, one final mystery remains. Whispers of secret orders, symbols etched in stone, knowledge hidden from kings and popes alike. Did secret societies exist during the Middle Ages? And if they did, what were they protecting? And more importantly, why did they need to hide? Stories of secret societies have haunted the corners of history for centuries. Whispers in stone corridors, hidden symbols in manuscripts, and the persistent question, who were they really? And what knowledge did they protect so fiercely that it had to remain in the shadows? Among the most famous of these was the Knights Templar. They began in 1119 as humble warrior monks. Their mission? To protect Christian pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. But within decades, they became one of the most powerful forces in Europe. They held castles across continents. They ran complex financial networks. And, most disturbingly, they possessed knowledge. Documents uncovered in France and Italy suggest they preserved rare texts from the Islamic world. Works on astronomy, mathematics, and science that Europe had never seen. Such knowledge was unsettling, especially to the Church. Their rise was too fast, too mysterious. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, with the help of Pope Clement V, brought the Templars down. They were accused of heresy, tortured, executed. But the most pressing question remains unanswered. What happened to the knowledge they held? Some believe their texts were hidden. Others say they were passed to new hands that belonged to the Illuminati. Though officially founded in the 18th century, some researchers believe the Illuminati inherited the secrets of earlier orders, particularly the Templars. Their legend is steeped in conspiracy, claims of hidden influence, manipulation, and silent power. While historians dismiss these stories as fantasy, the myth persists. because the hunger for hidden truth never fades. Then there were others, less famous, but just as enigmatic. The Hermetic Brotherhood, rooted in ancient Egyptian philosophy, claimed access to cosmic truths. Their manuscripts, recently uncovered in libraries across Italy and Germany, describe theories in alchemy, medicine, astronomy, and natural science. Ideas that terrified church authorities. These secret groups protected forbidden knowledge. They passed it through symbols, through coded texts, through rituals only the initiated could understand. And many paid dearly for their silence. Were these just stories? Or were they the true guardians of human knowledge during a time of censorship and suppression? Archaeological evidence increasingly suggests the latter. Hidden vaults, scrolls sealed within monastery walls, documents describing healing techniques, star charts, and chemical formulas, all centuries ahead of their time. They weren't imagined. They were real. Though their names became legend, distorted by fiction and film, their mission was real: to preserve knowledge against the forces that would bury it. Because throughout history, truth has always needed protectors. And while some worked in shadow, another great civilization illuminated the world, yet was quietly erased by Western history: Islamic civilization. Between the 7th and 13th centuries, while Europe called its time the Dark Ages, the Islamic world entered a golden age of brilliance. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and Damascus became beacons of science, art, and scholarship. Their contributions shaped the modern world. In mathematics, the Persian scholar Al-Khwarizmi wrote the foundational text on algebra, from which the word itself is derived. They also introduced the numeral 0-, a concept that revolutionized Western computation. In astronomy, scholars like al-Biruni and Ibn al-Haytham mapped the stars, calculated the Earth's radius, and explored the physics of light with a precision Europe wouldn't match for centuries. Ibn al-Haytham, often called the father of optics, described lenses, reflection, and vision in terms modern science would later adopt. In medicine, Avicenna's Canon of Medicine synthesized knowledge from Greek, Indian, and Persian sources. It became Europe's standard medical textbook, used for hundreds of years. Islamic physicians pioneered hospitals, surgery, anesthesia, and sanitation. So why has the West forgotten this legacy? Because of fear, because of pride, because of politics. After the Crusades, Christian Europe saw Islam as an enemy, and to admit that its enemy was once its teacher was unthinkable. So the narrative was rewritten. Islam was erased from the story of progress. From the Renaissance onward, historians promoted a myth that Europe had rediscovered Greece and Rome on its own. But that wasn't true. Much of what was recovered came through Islamic translations. From Arabic into Latin, through libraries in Toledo, Baghdad, Cairo, and beyond. Recently, these gaps have started to close. Manuscripts once buried have resurfaced. Clear evidence that Islamic civilization preserved the ancient world and laid the groundwork for Europe's rebirth. To ignore this is not just inaccurate, it is intellectually dishonest. Islamic history is not a side note. It is central to the story of civilization. Its erasure is a warning of what happens when history is written by victors with something to hide. And if we've learned anything, it's that the truth always returns. But if the story of Islamic brilliance was buried, then what about the events that helped bury it? Let's now confront one of the most mythologized and misunderstood events in Western history: the Crusades. For centuries, We've been told the story in black and white. Christian knights, holy war, the noble reclaiming of sacred lands. But peel back the piety, and the story changes. The Crusades were not just wars of faith, they were wars of power. Beginning with Pope Urban II's call in 1095, the Crusades were an opportunity to unite Christian Europe under the Pope's banner. They weren't just fighting Islam, they were reorganizing power at home. Kings and nobles saw the Crusades as a chance for wealth, for land, for control. The Holy Land was sacred, but it was also strategic. Routes through Syria, Palestine, and Egypt connected Europe to the riches of Asia. Outposts like Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli became economic hubs, feeding gold into European coffers. The war was cloaked in salvation, but its heart beat with ambition. The Fourth Crusade was never meant to end in betrayal. But in 1204, the unthinkable happened. Constantinople fell, not to its enemies, but to its allies. Western Christian forces pillaged a Christian city. They burned libraries, stole relics, shattered centuries of Byzantine glory. It was never about faith, it was about power, and beneath the armor and banners lay an even deeper ambition. Recent research reveals that many crusaders didn't just seek territory, they sought knowledge. Arabic texts in medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, preserved for centuries by Islamic scholars, were quietly taken back to Europe. And in silence, they helped ignite what would later be called the Renaissance. But that's not the story most people hear. Instead, we're told of valor, of sacrifice, of holy mission. What's often left out are the hundreds of thousands who died, not just Muslims, but Jews, and even Christians. What's forgotten is the cultural devastation, the destruction of peaceful cities where different religions had coexisted for centuries. Even Europe paid the price. The cost of endless campaigns plunged kingdoms into economic ruin. Tensions between rival nations deepened. And yet, the myths endured, because history was written not by the broken, but by the victorious. Today, lost texts from monasteries, rediscovered manuscripts in the Vatican, and archaeological evidence in the Middle East reveal a far different truth. The Crusades were not holy journeys. They were calculated moves on a geopolitical chessboard. Wars of wealth, control, and ideology. And only now, centuries later, are we beginning to see the full board. This truth matters, because the deeper we dig into history, the more we uncover a painful but undeniable fact. History has always been written by the victors. Through this journey, we've pulled back the curtain. We've uncovered what the record tried to hide. We saw how the Vikings, once branded as savages, were in fact skilled explorers and cultural connectors. We rediscovered the brilliance of Islamic civilization, whose knowledge transformed Europe, yet was erased from textbooks out of pride and rivalry. We revealed how the Crusades, wrapped in sacred language, concealed political agendas, conquest, and quiet looting of knowledge. And what we've learned is simple, but powerful. History is not a fixed truth. It is a lens dash, shaped, warped, and polished by those who hold the pen. But why does that matter? Because the stories we're told define how we see ourselves and how we see each other. Distorted history breeds dangerous myths. It fuels prejudice, conflict, and ignorance. Only by telling history honestly can we begin to repair the damage. Only then can we understand how we got here and how to move forward. Uncovering truth also protects something more personal, our freedom of thought. When knowledge is controlled, so are our ideas, our creativity, our questions. By challenging the record, we defend the future. Yet even now, despite everything we've uncovered, countless secrets remain. Civilizations buried beneath sand, scrolls still locked in vaults, ideas once feared, now quietly resurfacing. Could ancient myths prove true? Could our greatest beliefs be turned on their heads? We don't know yet, because the next chapter depends on us. You, the one listening right now, are part of this journey. The journey to dig deeper, to challenge the accepted story, to keep asking, what else has been hidden? So let me ask you, what mysteries do you want us to explore next? What secrets of history still keep you wondering? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Because your curiosity fuels everything we do. This isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning. History isn't a closed book. It's a living mystery. And together,